So we're going to start talking about the branches of government today. I know this is going to get confusing, but we'll just be persistent. We'll keep working at it. We had federalism, which was the levels of government, national, state, and local. And we did that to break up the king's powers. We didn't want another king-like government. Well, now we took it a step further, and we looked at all the powers the king had had when we were under his power. So, for example, the king controlled spending, what he was going to spend money on, who he was going to spend money on. The king was obviously the boss. The king actually was in control of trials and jails, and as we've talked about before, he could just lock you up if he didn't like you. You didn't get a trial. There wasn't really a judicial system, and it certainly wasn't fair. It was whatever the king wanted. The king made the laws. The famous one, no taxation without representation. So he passed tax laws. The people had no say in that whatsoever. The jails, the judicial system, the king totally controlled that. If you were someone that got in his disfavor somehow, you could find yourself locked up. The king decided on whether to go to war or not. There was no saying, no, king, we shouldn't go to this war. It was whatever the king wanted. The king picked people, appointed people to help him in the government. A lot of times those were fellow family members, not members of the royal family. And whoever the king picked, the king got, because he was the boss. So the colonists decided, you know what, we don't want that. We don't want another king-like government. And so if you envision this as like the bubble of the king's powers, along come the colonists with that Deck of Independence, the Declaration of Independence, and boom, they popped the king's bubble. And they said, you know what, let's get him. Okay, but now we had to beat him in a war, Revolutionary War. But let's design a better government. We don't want a king that has all these powers. So they designed 3 branches of government. They take all the king's powers from over on that other side, and they're like, let's break them up so that we don't have some one person, king, dictator-like figure that is going to tell us what to do and how to do it. He's not going to have all the power. So we created 3 branches, legislative, executive, and judicial. Let's start with the legislative. Legislative branch makes laws. Legislate means to write laws. The legislative branch has to approve how the president, the executive, wants to spend money. The president develops a budget, but Congress has to approve it. And this is a major fight that's going on in Washington, D.C. right now. If the president picks people to help him in the government, legislative branch has to approve who he picks. So he can't just pick his buddies from college. He can't just pick his family members. He has to pick highly qualified people capable of doing the job that he wants them to do, and Congress has to approve them. If the president wants to send our country to war, Congress has to approve it. Congress has to give him the power to take our country into war. It's not just one person saying we're going to war. The Congress has to actually declare war in order for the president to actively send troops into war. And if the president exceeds his powers, the legislative branch can impeach him, which means bring charges against the president for breaking laws, not just because they don't like him, but for breaking laws, and then the president can be removed from power by impeach. The executive branch, chief executive, head executive, that's the boss. That's like a Donald Trump, the head executive. So the president is the boss of our federal government. He's the boss of our country. He's the chief representative of our country. He's in charge of our federal government. One of his jobs is to appoint federal judges and U.S. Supreme Court judges. So he picks people that he thinks are highly qualified, and then legislative has to approve them, but the president gets to pick people for federal courts and for the U.S. Supreme Court. The president has to draft or write the budget. So he has to list how he wants the government to spend money, where we're going to spend it, how we're going to spend it, how much we're going to spend it. But he always has to get the legislative branch to approve the budget. This particular thing, the budget, has proved to be very difficult for our federal government in the last number of years. In fact, we're heading into a major fight over this next week. Another thing the president can do is if the legislative branch writes a bill that he doesn't like, the president can veto it. The president can say, no, I don't like it. Okay? Now, because legislative makes laws, if the president vetoes and says no to this proposed law, it still goes back to the legislative branch for the final say because they make the laws. Judicial branch, judges in the courts. So this little thing is the gavel that judges hit on the court to call the court to order. Okay? Now, the judicial branch's power is to think about laws that have been passed, and if someone sues saying that the law is unconstitutional, the judicial branch declares the law either constitutional, which means it's legal, it's allowed, or they declare it unconstitutional, which means they say no to this law, and the law is thrown out. Okay? Now, this only happens, that judicial branch only gets involved when someone sues saying that a law is unconstitutional. They do not check every single law that's passed. Only when someone has sued over a constitutional issue. In other words, they say that this law violates my rights in the Constitution. Then the case can ultimately make its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they have the power, the check and balance power, to throw out the law. So quick review. We got rid of we didn't want another government like the king, so we took all the powers that king had, and we burst his bubble. And we said we're going to form something better that's a little more equal and a little more balanced. We don't want another king. So 3 branches. Legislative, main job, write laws and approve what the president does. Executive, we got to have a boss. He executes laws, makes sure laws are carried out. He gets to appoint people to help run the government. And the final branch of government is judicial. So if the president and the legislative branch pass an unconstitutional law that violates someone's rights in the Constitution, the judicial can say no to that law, and that law is thrown out. And that's our 3-branch system of government at the federal level of government.